What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Facts on the Ground. I am here joined, as always, by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we're happy to have back on the show Denijal Jegić. He is a writer, he is a researcher, and he's written quite a bit about the Middle East, especially Palestine and Lebanon. He's also the author of a book called Trans-Intifada, the politics and poetics of intersectional resistance, some of which we'll hopefully talk about in a later episode. And this is episode 2 of our Palestine series with Denijal. And today we're going to start with something we missed sort of in the first episode, which is Haj Amin, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem back in the 30s and 40s. And he is probably most notoriously known for meeting with Hitler in the early 40s. So Denijal, can you talk about that meeting and why it still resonates today, especially among Zionists who like to claim that anti-Semitism is part and parcel of not just Palestinian culture, but Muslim culture, Arab culture?
Definitely. So yeah, as you mentioned, there is oftentimes this attempt to claim that anti-Semitism is something that originates from Palestinian culture, or it's something that is inherent to Islam or to the Arab world. And the representation of that particular meeting between Haj Amin al-Husseini and Hitler today is oftentimes used to perpetuate this idea that Palestinians even had allegedly a role in the Holocaust. One particular event was in 2015 when Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, publicly claimed that Hitler, and I'm quoting, Hitler did not want to exterminate the Jews, and then had the speech where he implied that it was al-Husseini who had convinced Hitler to seek what the Nazis referred to as the final solution. Now, this was very quickly condemned by numerous scholars, historians, including Jewish and Israeli historians and Holocaust scholars, because it does detach the moment from the context. So it is definitely very well documented. There was a meeting between Hitler and al-Husseini in November 1941, and I think it was a very infamous meeting that took place, but also transcripts of the meeting and of the discussions and of the correspondence that was held. At that time, of course, the death camps were already being built. So the idea to exterminate the Jews, to continue this genocide against the Jewish population in Europe, had already been there. So it wasn't al-Husseini who had convinced Hitler to kill the Jews. And I think there's also danger in this narrative because it kind of detaches anti-Semitism from the context back then, because it was, I mean, as if Hitler had to be convinced to kill the Jews, right? If we look back at this, period, and even before that, I mean, anti-Semitism was inherently entrenched in German culture and history, and Jews were persecuted and did not have equal rights before that time. So I think it's a weird claim to make, but it is part and parcel of these continuous attempts to blame Palestinians for violence against Jews, for anti-Semitism, or to imply that they had any role in the Holocaust. But even that particular remark that Netanyahu made was condemned by the German government officially, who then reiterated it was Germany who was responsible for the Holocaust and not the Palestinians.
Yeah, I think that this is something that we have seen happen on many occasions throughout many different conflicts, where religion is used as this emotional manipulation tool And that really seems to be the case here, where, the Israeli leaders were, I mean, this obviously, with the Holocaust going on, it's going to be an emotional trigger for any Jewish person. And so being able to use that as kind of a bludgeon against the Palestinian people, and to make it seem as if they were the ones responsible for the horror that happened in the Holocaust, that makes it very easy then for them to justify the land grab and the power grab and the expelling of Palestinian people. It makes it much easier to get your people to be willing to do that kind of oppression against others, comparing them to Nazis, which is a really dirty trick, but it's not something that we haven't seen before. I think it's happened across many different conflicts where religion is often used as a method of control and division. So yeah, I think that's important that we definitely hit on that, because we see it still today. Not to jump too far ahead, but Israel uses any criticism whatsoever of what the Israeli government is doing. You're immediately anti-Semitic. They've done it to Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, everybody. I mean, Bernie Sanders is Jewish, and they called him a self-hating Jew because he dared to say that Palestinians deserve human rights. So I think it's very instructive, and I think it's important that we touch on that, because they are still using that as, a method of attack today. So yeah, I'm glad we went back and covered that for sure.
Yep. Also would like to add that what we've also seen recently with the surge of the far right in many places in Europe is that there are right-wing extremist movements that also have to some extent tried to involve Palestinians retrospectively into the Holocaust, oftentimes because there is this intersection of right-wing, far-right movements in Europe and Zionism. Obviously, Zionism also having its own dimensions as a white supremacist movement. So at some point, even at one point in Germany, when the BDS movement, which is considered anti-Semitic there was a resolution that was proposed by the AfD, which is the far-right party in the parliament. And parts of it really tried to say that the boycott of Israel today, and as part of the BDS movement, is sort of a replication of the Nazi boycott of Jews. So there are oftentimes very weird attempts to link Palestinian efforts for liberation and decolonization, or not even that, like to Palestinian claims to human rights as something that is inherently connected to Nazism, which originates in Germany and has fascist roots there, and is dangerous on so many levels because it obscures many causes and consequences and the suffering of so many people.
And there's also the assumption built into Haj Amin meeting with Hitler that he represented all Palestinians, which I think is a very Orientalist perspective to take. It's certainly worth noting, as we have, that Haj Amin had that meeting and that it reverberates today. But again, there's this blanket implication that he represented all Palestinians at that time or ever, and that was never the case. He was certainly a revered and respected and followed figure in Palestinian society, but he did not fully represent Palestinian society.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair.
So now that we've covered that, which we were remiss to cover in the last episode, can we bring it up to 1967 and the war that took place then, and how this was a ramping up of Israel's military and economic might, especially with the assistance of Western powers, primarily the US?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, last time we talked about the Nakba, which refers to the events in 48 when Israel was founded and proclaimed as a state, and in 67 is oftentimes referred to as the Naksa, which translates to the setback in English, and refers to the Israel's claim that it had a victory over Egypt, Syria, and Jordan that war. Because what happened is that Israel had occupied Gaza, the West Bank, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the part of the Sinai Peninsula. And before that, Gaza was administered by Egypt, and West Bank and Jerusalem by Jordan. So what happened in 1967 is that Israel gained control of all of historic Palestine. So at that point, it basically, had full control, and all people since then who live in what is known as Palestine geographically have lived under Israeli military and political rule. And from then on, Israel was able to prove to its Western allies in the world that it's a military power, and it sort of received a more prestigious image in the West, and ended up from there on developing also a settlement industry and developing different modes for containment and control of the Muslim population, and more fragmenting the West Bank and Gaza, and engaging in the isolation of Palestinians, while increasingly, of course, receiving less and less criticism from the international community and becoming central for the West. And the occupation continues until today.
And would you say that this is about like when the United States specifically really dug their heels in their support of Israel? Because I know that before it wasn't, there really wasn't, the United States didn't really have, they weren't really picking a side here or there, but it seems like right about this time is when the United States decided that Israel was going to be our guy,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It became much stronger also culturally. It was also a time of, look at the media and Orientalist depictions of Arabs, of Palestinians, increased a lot during the 70s. This dichotomy of Israel being the Western friend, the Western outpost, the white ally in an allegedly barbarian and dangerous place became much more prominent in cultural productions, in the media. So it definitely had a broader impact on the broader population from then on.
And historically, there are so many precedents for what Israel's campaign against the Palestinians, its genocidal campaign. And one that comes to mind specifically is the British colonization of India, and also the founding of the United States, both of which, especially the founding of the United States, Israel took a lot of lessons from and applied to their own founding. But as far as the 1967 war goes, or the setback, as you called it, what was the catalyst for that war?
There were tensions basically since the establishment of Israel, particularly between Egypt and Israel at that time. But if we even go back before 48 into Zionist initial ideas and ideologies, there were ideas to get all of Palestine, the whole land. So even in 47, when the partition plan was introduced, which was refused by Palestinians, and there were numerous Zionists who said that they would officially accept the partition plan, but effectively their state would be all of Palestine, even if they had to reach that goal through force. So it is, it's not a coincidence. The idea to colonize all of Palestine had been there all along. And in 67, the political situation, economic implications, and Israel's military victory in that war just helped it further its goal more. And then after that, of course, it continued colonizing into the West Bank. So it has to be seen as a very crucial moment in a continuous history of colonialism. And it's still continuing to colonize. There's still a lot of space in the West Bank that's being taken away, and that will probably be taken away in the future as well.
Right. And another important thing about the 1967 war is that this was when the so-called Green Line was drawn. And that's something we've heard a lot about throughout history, or since 1967. And that Green Line has seemed to shift over the decades and roughly follows the apartheid wall that's being built in the West Bank. So I think that's another important legacy of the 1967 war to point out. And there was another point I wanted to make about.
It also feels like this
but I
was,
can't remember.
it felt like Israel was very much underestimated at this point. I think that Egypt and that everybody, oh, it's fine. We can handle Israel, and Israel came to play. Like they were ready. They were, their military had been built up significantly. So it felt like this was kind of an oversight of, not really paying attention to what Israel was capable of. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, because it really seems like everybody was kind of sleeping on Israel at this point. And this was kind of a waking up, like, oh, this is what they can do. So it seems like this is when we realized that Israel was, quite capable of handling itself.
What I wanted to add to the 1967 war is that it was also the genesis of Resolution 242 in the United Nations, which wholly condemns Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories.
Not like they care, but
right. But it's a resolution that's still referenced to this day, and is still referenced in the context of a two-state solution, which to my mind is pretty much dead, or not pretty much, it is dead.
It is, yeah.
And again, another historical echo that's very important. So I just wanted to make the point that that was the war that bore that resolution that we still hear so much about today.
Absolutely. And I think this resolution and many others that followed afterwards are significant on the one hand because they reiterate Israel's control of these territories is illegal under international law, and that Israel does not have the right to be present, but at the same time it is ignored or contested, Israel frames, I think, the occupied territories as contested at best, but depending on the different ideologies within Zionism, it is, and practices that are carried out by the state of Israel. Israel understands all of these territories to be part of its state, but at the same time also treats Gaza, at least, as an enemy territory, as something that does not belong to it. And this creates actually the situation of apartheid, and leads to, in the West Bank, to the situation where people are living under Israeli military and political control, but don't have rights, even though under international law, the occupying power is required to guarantee the safety of the occupied population, which is, of course, the opposite of what Israel is doing. And oftentimes, this has led to a rhetoric focusing on 67 as the initial, or as the beginning of the problem, whereas, of course, it dates back to 48 or even to the 1890s when Zionism emerged. So whereas these resolutions have not contributed to anything that may weaken Israel's grip on these territories, they have perpetuated sort of a liberal Zionist narrative that obscures the 2 decades, at least the 2 decades before, and the refugee crisis, which had been created 2 decades before.
Yeah, and it's important to bring that up because there are prominent people like Noam Chomsky who like to start the clock at 1967 and continue to argue, despite all evidence to the contrary, that a two-state solution is possible. And again, his prominence, his reach makes that dangerous. It makes it makes what's happening there almost ahistorical in a sense.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's, if you just look at the lines that they drew, the border line, it's ridiculous. It's a jigsaw puzzle. And it made no sense. And I think that made, the whole thing kind of farcical. It really just didn't make any sense. It was handled very poorly. And, the UN is so toothless here, clearly. Israel laughs in their faces and they continue with these settlements, illegal settlements. I mean, the whole world knows it's illegal and they continue to do it anyways. So yeah, I absolutely agree that, people like Noam Chomsky know better. And we know he knows better. He's not a dumb guy, So yeah, I think Jesse is 100% right. It makes it extremely dangerous when people like him, who people understand are incredibly intelligent and, a thought leader. Noam Chomsky, as many issues as I have with him, was, hugely influential for me growing up. And I think he is with so many people. And I think that is what makes his take on this so extremely dangerous. For sure.
Right. And excuse me. I forget what point I was going to make about that, about Chomsky. But yeah, the highlight being that he's always, as long as I've read and listened to him, started the clock at 1967. And again, I think that's ahistorical, that's dangerous, that's misleading to a lot of people who might just be starting to research what's happening in Palestine and what's happened to Palestinians for arguably over a century now.
I also think the narrative of 67 kind of asks Palestinians, the indigenous people of the land who were expelled in that 19 years before that time, to forget about their claims to the land. And even the words that we use about occupied territories, many Palestinians argue that all of Palestine is occupied, not just what had been seized in 67. So yeah, I definitely agree. It does have very dangerous implications that erase a lot of suffering that had been there, had developed previously.
And between 67 and then the next war, the 6-Day War in 1973, we did see a really, I would say, almost massive illegal buildup of settlements in the West Bank and in Gaza, colonies in the West Bank and in Gaza. And a lot of that had to do with military and economic might and using that to steal land to fulfill Zionist philosophy, Zionist protocol, whatever you want to term it. But at the same time, there were also colonists, Jewish colonists who, and they're still there today, who actually believe that they have a biblical claim to the land and that justifies the violence they daily, unremittingly carry out against Palestinians. And it seems, though, that they've been weaponized, especially from 1967 onward, by the Israeli government to, I suppose, bolster the Israeli government's find favor with the United States. And so the government, the military, can keep acquiring weapons from the United States and testing weapons provided by the United States, or even their own manufactured weapons against Palestinians in ghetto laboratories like Gaza. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit, the military and economic aspect versus these Jewish colonists who feel, as some have said, that this is their land because they feel it in their bones.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are different narratives that inform this settler colonial drive to go into the West Bank and evict Palestinians from their homes and claim it's their own land. So there are, of course, people who have a religious, or who find religious justification. Then, of course, Zionism was initiated as a secular movement. So there initially that had really opposed Judaism, according to many scholars. So oftentimes it's based on myths and the way in which Israel constructs a narrative and tries to find a link to a present, from the present to a past that wasn't there. And this is, I think, also goes back to the core of the difference between the indigenous people and the settlers. So Palestinians have a presence in the land, have a claim to the land, have been there for generations, whereas Zionists haven't. So oftentimes this idea of going to into Palestine and claiming it's their land, they have to justify it somehow. So be it through religious or other, historical, ahistorical perspectives. But effectively, it is the Palestinians, what they have to do as indigenous people to become criminalized is just basically exist on their land. And it has definitely, as you said, it has a very particular military component. Also, I'd like to point out that many of the settlers are armed and are under direct protection of the Israeli army. So settler violence which is, in my opinion, something that is also oftentimes overlooked in media representations of Palestine in the West in particular, is something that occurs structurally in Palestine, and settlers oftentimes, or most of the time, don't, obviously don't get any consequences, don't experience any consequences for what they're doing. And how could they? Because, I mean, their whole presence on that land is based on the idea that they think that they are superior because of their, don't know, I wouldn't like to use the word race, but because of how they construct themselves through racial self-segregation from the indigenous community. And then, of course, this has, a lot of emotional attachment, I guess, for many Zionists that really perpetuates this idea that it's, their land and it's a continuous conquest of the land.
I think that's a really important point to make. There was a video that was floating around Twitter a couple of days ago that really exemplifies that point. There was a man who had just taken over a Palestinian's home, and they were arguing with him. "You stole our house," and he said, "Well, if I don't steal it, if I don't live here, somebody else is it's not yours anyway. Somebody else is just going to come live here." And it's that kind of entitlement that they really do feel like they are, the chosen people to be on this land. And it doesn't matter that there were already people living there, and they don't see the Palestinians as human beings who are, also entitled to land and houses. And, they've been there. So it really is kind of this, this superiority. I think that's a good way of put. They really do feel superior to Palestinians, and that they're entitled to this land. And it doesn't matter to them that it's not theirs, and that they're just coming to steal somebody's houses. Because as this guy was saying, if I don't live here, it's just going to be somebody else. So it's not your house anyway. It's a really it's really disgusting, actually, the way that they think of it.
Yeah, and there's another. I was just going to say, one of the many cruel ironies of the colonies, especially in the West Bank now, is that the houses, the Palestinian houses, especially the houses, but also the olive groves. But looking at the houses that are destroyed, oftentimes the reason used is that the Palestinians who live in those houses do not have the proper permits to live there, to live on that land, even though a lot of them have deeds to their houses going back to the Ottoman times, the Ottoman Empire. Yet the colonists can go into the West Bank as far as the Jordan River if they want to, and there actually are illegal outposts quite close to the Jordan River. You can actually Airbnb some of them, from what I've seen on a map, but those are also technically illegal under Israeli law because they don't have permits, but they're allowed to exist on that land, to build on that land, to steal that land. And the contradiction there is so blatant, and the irony is so cruel that I can't help but point it out.
Yeah. This whole permit system is also part of this colonial bureaucracy. It's just a way to prevent Palestinians from accessing the rights and to impose a legal differentiation between the settler community and Palestinians. So how come that the state that was established in 1948 requires people to have permits for their houses that have been there before the state even existed?
Yes. And it's a very weird thing anyways to, establish the state of Israel and then put them in charge of governing a people that they've been fighting with. And now we've seen what happens when you do that. I mean, Palestinians are treated as, not even second-class citizens, really third-class citizens. There's open air prisons, and there are special roads that are Israeli only. And there's, it's complete apartheid. Like, there is no argument against that. And so it's really weird to me that was ever seen as a reasonable solution to what was happening on the land there, to put Israel in charge of governing a people that they've been fighting with. That's not going to end well. Clearly, that's not going to end well. So yeah, it's a very bizarre situation and it always reminds me of the pale blue dot, Carl Sagan's thing, when he talks about how, there are these rulers who are fighting over like this tiny little corner of the world and killing each other over this tiny little corner of the world that we're going to inhabit for like a fraction of a millisecond of time in the big picture. And it's just really depressing that that's humanity, and that's what we choose to do with our time on Earth. It's depressing.
Yep.
I
But
would
also, I
agree
think,
with that.
because you said, humanity, I think it's such an important word because Palestinians have been dehumanized to such an extent that, and to go back to the example you mentioned about this guy who basically stole this house from the Palestinian family, wife and camera, and said, if I don't steal it, someone else will steal it. I think it just really shows to what extent Palestinians are not regarded as human beings. And even that is in, the initial, among the first Zionist settlers, the idea was that Palestine is a land without a people, for a people without a land. So the idea that the land is empty and can be, taken over was there all along as well.
Yeah, and also making the desert bloom was another trope, or still is a trope that's thrown around. But speaking of entitlement, in 1973 there was the 6-Day War, and that led to the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights in Syria, which are still occupied, now known as Trump Heights, after Donald Trump, former president, was thoroughly involved in officializing or making official that occupation. So can we talk about the 6-Day War for a bit, how it started, what happened, and why it's still important today?
Sure, yeah. So the 6-Day War happened in 73, primarily between Egypt and Israel, where, Israel had occupied parts of Egypt previously. It was a brief war where Israel once again claimed victory. It had, however, what was, I think, significant about this war, it effectively led later on to the first so-called peace agreement between an Arab country and Israel, which was later on in that decade through I think it's Camp David, between Egypt and Israel, and then eventually put them in a state of where they are, normalized, more or less. And this has effectively, again, in the long term, strengthened Israel's position, because it had a war with that neighboring country that was shared solidarity and a support for a Palestinian cause, and effectively having so-called peace with it. And then later on, of course, with Jordan as well, which again has strengthened its position and allowed it to expand its hegemony in the region.
And we should be clear about the fact that Egypt is still active in the occupation of Palestinians in Gaza. It controls the Rafah crossing into Egypt and seldom lets Palestinians in to Egypt. They're probably quite happy to let them out if they make it in, but I don't know how long that's been the case. I believe it's been on and off, just like Israel's relationship with Egypt. But I think that's a point that needs to be made and remembered. And also that Sadat, who helped broker or was part of brokering the peace treaty or peace agreement, if you will, that you just mentioned, he ended up being assassinated shortly afterward because of that. And I don't know what that says to the conversation, but it certainly speaks volumes about the perhaps cynicism of Israel, especially at this point, starting to enter into international agreements that it had no intention of abiding by, which is what we still see today. So you would agree with that?
Yeah. Even then, if we look at, Egypt, it was, for Israel, occupying part of Egypt's territory was maybe also intended as a way to have some pressure against Egypt to maybe coerce it into some sort of agreement. But yeah, definitely. I mean, and then of course, shouldn't forget Egypt is a military ally of the United States as well. So Israel's relations within the region oftentimes fall into this axis of US allies and proxies. It cannot be detached from these dimensions.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of proxies. And I think it should be noted that in the 70s is when Netanyahu, Bibi, started to really make a name for himself. And that was at first under the auspices of the Yonatan Institute, which was named after his brother, I believe it was, who was killed in the so-called raid on Entebbe. And a movie's been made about it. I think I mentioned this with Charles Bronson, and it's also featured in the film Munich, I believe, which is actually quite worth watching. So is the Charles Bronson one for comedic effect, although it's very cynical comedic effect. But
my favorite kind.
So since we're speaking about the 70s, I wanted to point out that that's when Netanyahu really started to make his rise through the political ranks to where he is today. And at the same time, toward the end of the 70s, first in 1978, followed by an invasion in 1982, is when we saw Israel get really involved in Lebanon. And a big part of that had to do with the PLO's presence in Lebanon, among other offshoots or affiliated groups, I suppose you could say. So can you talk about Israel's increasing presence in Lebanon during that time?
Yeah. So yeah, as you pointed out,
occupations of Lebanon, I should say.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, it was, I think, in the 50s when Palestinian resistance started to increasingly slowly organize, and effectively in the 60s the PLO emerged, which was an umbrella organization that includes different movements of various ideologies that are dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, and many of which were, obviously, maybe we go back to 48 when the Nakba happened and Palestinians were expelled. Many of them had to flee to neighboring places, including Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So till today, the presence of Palestinians as refugees dates back 73 years in Lebanon, and many Palestinians still live, or most of them, in various refugee camps in the country. At that point, it was during the 70s that there was, the Lebanese war started in 75. And the war was complex with many various political movements, ideologies, groups following different goals, but Palestinian resistance, organized resistance, played a role, was active in Lebanon at one point, which led the Israeli regime to use this as justification to invade Lebanon. But of course, Israel, the Zionist military back then in 48 had already had a massacre in Lebanon in 48. So it's not that it was the activity of Palestinian resistance in Lebanon that triggered the Zionist claims on Lebanon, or so basically in 78 there was a first invasion, and from 82 onwards, again in 82 the Israelis came and invaded Beirut, and it was during that summer that thousands of civilians were killed, and also when the Sabra and Shatila genocide took place, which was a horrible genocide where thousands of people, refugees, were massacred in their camps by a far-right Lebanese militia that was aligned by Israel, with Israel, and supervised by
Christian
they were supervised by by Ariel Sharon at that time. But I mean, effectively, the Israel's aim was to destroy Palestinian resistance, and whereas they have managed to weaken it definitely in Lebanon. I think Israel's invasion of Lebanon is part of its transnational violence that just shows that it is extending its violence against Palestinians across the border. So many Palestinians who fled in 48 were decades later massacred in a different country by the Israeli army. And then the occupation continued until the year 2000. The southern part of Lebanon was under illegal, brutal Israeli occupation. Israel came back in 2006, but the rhetoric changed throughout time. So whereas initially it was the PLO, later on it was Hezbollah, which was defined as a terrorist organization and as a reason for Israel to justification to invade and kill. So yeah, and it continues until today. Israeli warplanes above Lebanon on a daily basis and several invasions. I think we must have mentioned this in one of the previous episodes.
Yeah, they fly over and purposely initiate sonic booms to try to, or not try to terrorize the people below.
Scare, to intimidate.
Yes, and this may be a little bit of a tangent, but the psychology behind this is really fascinating to me, because the reason why, the Jewish people wanted their own state is because they felt persecuted and they felt like they needed to flee other places, and were sort of refugees. And now they've created that situation for other people. And that's fascinating to me, that you can have that history and then, move on to perpetuate that on other people. To me, it seems like that should be something that you would never want to see happen again. And it really does show the effectiveness of the propaganda, of the linking, Arab people to Nazism, and of, dehumanizing them and making them the other. It really has been an effective thing that you can make these people who have this brutal history then create that for someone else. And not have a problem with it. I mean, we saw a couple of weeks ago that Zionists were running through the streets, yelling death to Arabs, and terrorizing the people. And I mean, you see it all the time. Palestinians are getting harassed and beaten and all of that, just walking through the streets, just by normal, everyday Israeli citizens. And that's really depressing. It's fascinating, but it's depressing that, you can so quickly and easily forget your own history, and make that a reality for someone else. So sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but it's just always something I've always thought about.
I think it's a really important point, especially because it's also fascinating and fucked up, because it's an obvious point. Not to say that you're making a simplistic obvious point, but it's an obvious point that you're not allowed to say because it's been branded as anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
I've
been branded anti-Semitic for saying it, for bringing it up.
Israel
has
has laid claim to that narrative to make it anti-Semitic, even though it's a matter of historical record, and there's nothing anti-Semitic about it. It's a completely fair comparison or deconstruction of what's happening. So Danielle, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to definitely, as you say, to differentiate between, first of all, Zionism as a political ideology, as a settler colonial movement that is, as many argue, not related to Judaism as a religion, or to Jews as, of course, an ethnic or group, or so because also Zionism is a quite recent movement, but Zionism has tried to use them or Jews for its rhetoric and propaganda. But I mean, it is a white supremacist. Zionism is a white supremacist movement, and yeah, I mean, it is sad and dangerous, I think, to have these equations, because anti-Semitism does exist. It still exists. It never, I mean, and it exists in different parts of the world, and Jews are victims of racism. So, but there have, of course, been these attempts to equate Judaism with Zionism and to brand any sort of anti-colonial critique as racism, which I mean is really dangerous on so many levels. And I think, just to give you an example of why I find these claims by Israel that it is working on behalf of the Jewish people. Obviously, this is rhetoric, part of their rhetoric that Israel employs. But I mean, just in Beirut, for example, the synagogue in downtown Beirut and at least another synagogue in the country were bombed by Israel during the war. So, I mean, there are many, many incidents and events that really show Israel's contempt for Judaism. But this is, oftentimes gets lost in this very ugly equation and the claim that Israel speaks on behalf of Jewish people, even though there are so many Jews who are outspoken and against both this equation or against Israel's policies or Zionism as such. So I think it's very dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the 70s, I wanted to quickly highlight or home in on some of the Palestinian resistance groups that were active at the time, for example, the PFLP, and the tactics they undertook to try to liberate Palestine. And I'm thinking of, in particular, Layla Khaled, who was with the PFLP, a Palestinian Marxist leaning, you could say, if not Marxist, liberation group. And some of the tactics they undertook were called terrorism by a lot of the West. So could you talk briefly about, in particular, Layla Khaled and the actions the PFLP undertook to not just try to liberate Palestine, but draw international attention to the genocide against Palestinians?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned, it was, I think, in the late 60s and 70s that Palestinian resistance organizations were more active and began to organize. But first movement dates back to the 50s. I think it was in 52 where the Arab nationalist movement was founded by George Habash, and which was, like many of these movements, secular and pan-Arab in its orientation, with oftentimes, particularly starting from the mid-50s, with a perspective of the third world, a global South orientation, and then, of course, within the frameworks of the non-aligned movement. So oftentimes these movements were secular, and then the PFLF favored a one-state solution. So the idea was to liberate all of Palestine and to allow the refugees to return to their homes. And as you said, it was a Marxist and a secular movement, and was then effectively run as a terrorist organization, even though the PFLF argued that Jews could have equal rights with Palestinians and live in peace, which is, on the one hand, that argument compared to Israel's idea that, especially at that time, when Palestinians lived under complete military rule in all of historic Palestine. So, and yet they were, as you said, characterized or defined as a terrorist organization. Layla Khaled she was born in Haifa, Palestine, and then was, I think, 4 years old when the Nakba happened, and came to Lebanon as a refugee, and was later engaged in organized Palestinian resistance and participated in the hijacking of a plane. And that was a way, I guess, to also raise international awareness of the Palestinian cause, because it was in '69, I think, when a plane hijacking happened. So it was 2 years after Israel's victory and seizure of all of Palestine, and Palestinians were still ignored. They were not part of Western discourse. They were not getting the attention that even that it wasn't, Palestine was not a word that was part of the discourse back then. So that was, I guess, a way to raise attention. But in that plane hijacking, no one had actually died. And Leila Khaled was one of many Palestinians who were political prisoners fighting for the liberation, and has, I think, remained an icon for many in Palestine and beyond.
Yeah, and she's still alive today, it should be noted, and still very active in Palestinian resistance.
Yep.
And an interesting note about her is that she's undergone several facial surgeries in order to keep it low pro, if you will.
Yep.
I don't know if she still has to worry about that anymore, but for several decades, she had to do that as part of staying underground, so to speak. And
I think it's interesting that they label, I mean, it's not surprising, but to label it terrorism. Well, I mean, what if somebody invades your country and steals your land? Are you not supposed to fight back? I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. And so the fact that the West, has helped perpetuate that kind of rhetoric and label it as that the Palestinians are the terrorists, not the people who are invading their country, occupying their land and oppressing them, again, speaks to the power of language surrounding these issues and how the narrative is spun. And again, I've said this a million times, I don't think anybody does PR better than Israel. They're very, very good at it. I think they've learned a lot of it from the United States, but I think that they've even surpassed the United States at how well they are at pumping out, a controlled narrative when they need to. It's kind of terrifying.
Yeah, speaking of PR, I'll find it in my Twitter madness warehouse. But one night I was on Twitter and this advertisement popped up, this anti-Leila Khaled advertisement. I forget which Zionist group sponsored it, but I'll find it and share it, and I'll link to it in the show notes too, just the tweet, because it's bizarre, and it specifically targets her. Like she's, like her activity in Palestinian resistance nowadays, like she's still hijacking planes, and it makes her out to be this mortal threat and completely whitewashes the history of whom she's been and what she's done. So just an interesting side note on Leila. So I'll find that and link to that so everybody can see it. So going from that, we talked about how those groups ended up in Lebanon for a while. Just a point I wanted to make about the hijacking is, think about how indifferent the world must be to your suffering that you have to hijack a plane to draw attention to your suffering, to the genocide that's being carried out against you. Again, another very cruel.
I don't know though that it's indifference. I think that it's especially in the West, you just don't hear about it. Nobody,
right.
It's not something that's discussed. Most people are completely unaware, or were completely unaware. I think it's definitely different now. But at that time, people you didn't hear about Palestinians, that wasn't a thing. It was, very much hidden from the public. So I think that it's sad that they had to go to those extremes. I'm not condoning hijacking planes, but what else are they supposed to do at that point? If your people are being slaughtered, your land's being stolen, I don't know what, again, that's why it's interesting and completely unsurprising that they would label it as terrorism, because that's the propaganda that they need to put out in order to, demonize Palestinians and make them, the threat. But it's, to me, that's defense. You're defending yourself or attempting to.
Israel's slaughtering Palestinians wholesale, and one hijacked El Al flight, and the world stops, But
and I think that that's interesting too, because Israel often tries to pretend like they're defending themselves. That's always the line. Still today, that's the line that we hear, that they're defending themselves from kids with, kite kites on fire.
Arson
You know what I'm
kites.
saying? Like they have
Sure,
rocks and
yeah.
sticks, and Israel has like a whole ass army. And you know, it's ridiculous. But that's the narrative. That's the way that they control who is seen as the enemy.
Right.
Absolutely.
And so going back to the 80s, and the Lebanese civil war is still happening, and the PLO is eventually forced out of Lebanon, which was the goal of Israel, the goal of the US. And Israel at this time, the late 80s, give or take, starts promoting Hamas as an alternative to the PLO. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, Hamas's origins, and maybe clear up a little bit of the propaganda and obfuscation surrounding Hamas as a group, and what they've done and what they do for Palestinians.
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, I mean, the PLO was, you know, and still continues to be a major force of Palestinian political ways of organizing, but it has shifted its views throughout the decades. It was initially, its initial idea was to liberate Palestine, to restore the Palestinian homeland, and effectively within the 1990s through the Oslo Accords and the negotiations with Israel, things have shifted. And Hamas emerged in the late 80s and 87 as another resistance organization that has a particularly Islamic character. So it's an Islamic resistance movement that today has, of course, its base in Gaza, and has dedicated itself to liberating Palestine from Israeli occupation, like many other resistance groups. Now, regarding Hamas, interestingly, I feel it's one of the words that we hear very often in Western media and the coverage on Palestine. Even though Hamas emerged in 87, which is approximately a century after Zionism emerged as a settler colonial movement. So the origins of why Hamas actually exists, what the situation is in Gaza like, is oftentimes obscured. But today it is the main organized, militarily organized resistance against Israel that is active within Gaza, where it has a very strong position, and is, of course, labeled a terrorist organization in various places, and by Israel and by the United States. But for many Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, it is a defense against Israeli attacks, because Gaza has been under a blockade and siege for over a decade, where Israel basically controls 2 million people in a very small place that is densely populated, and then bombs them every once in a while. And I mean, I think this is a humanitarian.
What do they call it?
That,
mowing the lawn?
Hmm?
They call it mowing the lawn.
Right.
These periodic slaughter campaigns.
Yeah.
But please go ahead.
I think that was part of the rhetoric that was used in one of the wars, the last ones in 2000. There was one in 2014, 2012, and oftentimes it is a way of testing weapons, containing people, again, developing different technologies. And yeah, Palestinians are actually in an open air prison in Gaza. So the position of Hamas has to be taken into consideration. The context has to be taken into consideration when we talk about the position of Hamas. And yet, just recently, when the latest events happened in Jerusalem that you mentioned previously, with Zionists marching and screaming death to Arabs, in which many Palestinians were injured, there were at the same time Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. And I read in one major Western media outlet that Hamas was referred to as the group that wants to destroy Israel. So it's oftentimes demonized in advance, whereas the context is obscured, and the fact that actually Hamas exists because maybe Israel is trying to destroy Palestinians is erased, I guess, from that context.
Right, absolutely. And
that's such an important point too, because that really does get lost. People never talk about the fact that Hamas is really just a response to the fact that Israel is trying to destroy Palestine. And that never gets talked about. It's always Hamas is the enemy. They're the extremists. They're the terrorists. And it's never that. It's just defense, really, again.
But in the interest of not whitewashing, they do have a social code, if you will, that doesn't always end up well for.
Oh, for sure. I'm not saying that they're, all great people.
For informants, especially those who collaborate with Israel and inform, they usually end up dead, executed if they're found out. But what's interesting about that, and I don't know if this is done in every situation, is that after the person, which is almost 100% a man, is killed, that Hamas will then take care of his family, I guess, for as long as they exist until they die, or maybe there's a stipulated time frame that they can do that. I think it's a weird, or I don't want to say weird because that sounds Orientalist, but it's a very interesting juxtaposition that Hamas has there.
And just to clarify, I'm not saying the Hamas is like a bunch of great people running around doing great things. I'm just saying that the context is necessary.
Right.
If you come in and colonize a country and oppress a people and steal land, there will be, for every action, there is an equal reaction. And so there's going to be, groups that pop up that are going to be fighting back against that. And I think that a lot of time that context gets completely lost in the conversation. So so don't come for me. I'm not saying Hamas is, great people.
No,
It's so ridiculous.
I don't think you said that at all.
No, I just wanted to clear it up because how they will come for me.
Yeah, somebody will come for me.
Yeah, somebody will. One of my stalkers will come for me. It'll happen.
So in the 80s is...
Oh, I think it's sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that in the 80s is when we started to, not that the Palestinian people weren't resisting before then, but we really started to see them just have enough and realize that the world was turning a blind eye for a complex of reasons, and that they had to, I'm talking about civil society here, had to fight back themselves, whether violently or non-violently. And the first Intifada occurred. And I'm wondering if we can get into a little bit of that, at least the origins of it and some of the key events of it, and then perhaps wrap up after that and leave that as a place to start off for the next episode.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So things have, shifted with time. I think it was in the days where the PLO gained international attention, but also recognition. So it was during that time that it was recognized as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and was able to enter the international political stage to some extent. So there was an increased maybe visibility of Palestine and Palestinians and awareness much more than in the decades before. But of course, Israel's policies just continued the way they did before, and I think the apartheid regime and occupation continued to be very violent. So of course, Palestinians were at one point, were more and more tending towards an uprising, as eventually and started with the Intifada, which were uprisings of Palestinians who were protesting. And that, I think, event has even more increased the visibility on the international stage, because the Intifada is a word that people are familiar with, even though the word itself is, of course, rhetorically abused from different directions. But it was It was an uprising, it was a protest, but it was also a way to reaffirm national identity and a connection to the land and a collective sort of resistance and survival, because it's been at that point 4 decades since the expulsion of Palestine. It was supported by Palestinians within Palestine, but also beyond. And I think it marked a very important point within Palestinian identity as well.
And that began in 1987, correct?
Right. That was the first Intifada, yep.
Right. The second one being in 2000, or was it 2002? Yep. 2002 was the Jenin massacre. Yeah, 2000 was when the second Intifada kicked off. Well, we'd definitely like to talk more in detail about the first Intifada. So again, perhaps we
leave
can
it as a cliffhanger.
Yeah, leave it as a cliffhanger. So perhaps we can start there for the third installment of this series. But Danielle, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
And we look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you, everybody, for watching this episode of Facts on the Ground. Our guest today has been Denijal Jegić. He's a writer, a researcher. He is also the author of a book called, I have it written down here, my memory's not that good. Trans-Intifada, The Politics and Poetics of Intersectional Resistance. You can find that online. You can also find his writing at Mondoweiss and any other outlets you want to plug where your writing is?
You can just check my website, which is myname.com. I think there's a list of all writings that are accessible.
Okay.
Cool. We can link all that in the show notes so everybody can find it easily.
Yep, that'll be fine. And people can find you on Twitter at, what's your handle?
DENIJEG.
Okay, great. And thank you very much for joining us once again. And we look forward to keeping the conversation going.
I'm here.
Take care.